Welcome to the 250th episode of The Read Out Loud, a weekly biotech podcast from Stat. I'm Meg Terrell.
I'm Adam Feuerstein.
And I'm Damian Garde.
It's Thursday, March 16th, and here's what we're going to talk about this week.
A Stat investigation published this week found that treatment algorithms powered by artificial intelligence are being used more frequently by Medicare Advantage insurance plans to deny claims, even when continued treatment is medically justified. Stat reporter Bob Herman joins us to discuss.
We'll also talk about the latest news in the life sciences, including the continued fallout of a bank run, the return of Carl Icahn, and a long-awaited pharmaceutical megadeal.
But first, a word from our sponsor.
Calling all healthcare innovators and biotech enthusiasts. Are you ready to discover the cutting-edge developments at the intersection of medicine, biology, and technology? Mark your calendars for May 3rd and 4th to join the Stat Breakthrough Summit in San Francisco. This exclusive event features industry thought leaders such as Dr. Mary Claire King, known for her groundbreaking discovery of the BRCA1 gene, and Dr. Kizzmekia Corbett, whose team developed the Moderna COVID-19 vaccine, and Jennifer Doudna, the co-inventor of CRISPR. You'll be at the forefront of the discussions driving the future of healthcare. Don't miss this rare opportunity to network with your peers and gain a deeper understanding of the thrilling advancements in healthcare and technology. Register now at statnews.com/summit, and we'll see you there.
So let's start with the fallout from Silicon Valley Bank. Of course, this was a really important event in the biotech space as well as the tech space and the general financial world. Damian, maybe explain what happened and what this means to biotech.
Yeah, so we're now 7 days roughly removed from the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, by which I mean the moment in which federal officials stepped in to shut the bank down and backstop its deposits because, well, there had been a run on it. But I think, zooming out, this is a financial institution with which roughly 50%, by its own estimation, of all tech and biotech companies in the United States did business, whether that meant keeping deposits there, borrowing money from them, or engaging in any of their other financial services, which included underwriting IPOs. So this is like a linchpin of the scare quotes innovation economy of the United States. And so its failure was obviously bad and has had reverberations throughout the industries, both industries that it affects. Cutting to a week later, people probably know that over the weekend, we got news that all of the deposits in the bank, not just those under $250,000, were backstopped by essentially the federal government. There's some nuance there, and there's some debate over whether that constitutes a bailout, which we can spare our listeners and ourselves from really thinking about. But the issue continues, or the issue of the collapse of SVB continues to be important, in part because federal regulators are, I guess as we speak, trying to auction the bank off, whether in entirety or piece by piece. And that auction has not yet found, I guess, buyers that federal regulators think are worth selling to. So it leaves a lot of people in limbo. A lot of people pulled their money out of SVB, naturally, because there was just a run on it, and that's frightening. But a lot of people either didn't or can't because, as we're kind of learning, a lot of the loans that SVB lent out to startups had covenants in place where you had to do your banking with SVB, which is a pretty clever little thing, and it helped build the bank up to what it became. But when it is a bank without really official ownership and whose exact existence is in limbo, that's very stressful. If you're a company that feels like you want to pull your money out of this bank that was quite recently on fire, but if you do, you could be considered to be in default. But also in default to whom is a little bit of a mysterious question because you don't know who's going to own your loan in the future. And then on the other side, if you're a potential buyer for this, a lot of these loans, these are not like loans to a hardware store where it's based on how much money you make or the real assets of your store or whatever. These startups are not like that. They're cash burning entities. So they carry what's called venture debt, which is basically loans written out to a company based on how much venture capital it has raised in the past, that being the likelihood that it can repay it. When times were good during the boom times, these would be short-term loans because they were basically bridging companies between their inevitable financing rounds. Now that it's really hard for biotech and tech companies to raise venture capital money, it's also really hard to put valuations on these loans. So like, I realize I'm kind of just rambling about how this is a spiraling mess, but nobody even really knows the value of SVB's loan book because of everything that happened that unwinded the bank in the first place.
So basically what you're saying is that there's a lot of angst in biotech right now?
Damn.
So good. Angst. Yeah, I think you're right, Meg. There is angst. And I would maybe to spin this forward a little bit, it's some of the angst is about who or what is going to sort of fill the void that is left by the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank. Damien, as you mentioned, this was a bank and a financial institution that was sort of integral to the biotech startup world, also the tech startup world. And right now, there really isn't anyone to take its place. Someone may come in and buy the assets, but will that buyer be, have the sort of same risk tolerance or have the same relationships with the venture capitalists and with the startup world, and so that's all a little bit. That's just not known right at this point, and maybe that's where there's more unease. I think there's less unease now about kind of the financial situation that startups, at least let's say on last Saturday, found themselves in, where they were worried about whether they were going to be able to make payroll, where their money was and how they were going to access it. Because it seems like now that has been resolved. But just moving forward, who does business with these startups and how that impacts, the creation of new companies is just kind of a big question mark.
And I think one, piece of this that people in the biotech world are really focused on is the role of Leerink. Adam, maybe just refresh us on what Leerink is, why it matters to this space, and what might happen.
Yeah, as part of Silicon Valley Bank's, or the parent company of Silicon Valley Bank, a part of their expansion was the acquisition of Leerink Partners, which was a healthcare-focused investment bank based in Boston, founded by Jeff Leerink and his brother. And it had grown in size and stature along with biotech world. They do financing, financial services, and obviously I think they're probably best known for, the research that they do. Jeff Porges was their lead biotech analyst there for a long time. They were acquired by SVB as part of that expansion, and now it's sort of it's one of those assets that is kind of in limbo. There were reports, I think, over the weekend, possibly that again Jeff Leerink, who is the founder of Leerink Partners, is trying to put together a syndicate to basically buy back the investment bank, and that's a possibility. But it's Leerink is in a sort of important part of the biotech world on the sell side, and certainly in the sort of publicly traded world. Everyone reads their research, and they've done banking with them, and so that's a business that we hope just sort of doesn't just sort of go by the wayside because of being part of the sort of the collateral damage of the bank's collapse.
So speaking of things that harken back to the good old days of 2008. Meg, Carl Icahn is in the news this week.
Good
what is he?
segue.
Yeah, I worked on that. I put on my Shutter shades and my early Lady Gaga. What is Carl up to these days?
I have a thick black eyeliner on my bottom lashes, if we're going back a decade plus. So Carl Icahn, who used to play a major role in the biotech industry, I actually moved over to cover biotech at Bloomberg from covering big pharma because of the Genzyme deal, which he was a key player in. He's been absent from the space for a while after he lost his healthcare-focused specialist, Alex Denner, who went on to start his own fund. Now he's back in Illumina, the largest maker of genome sequencing equipment, basically putting out a letter on Monday that was broken by the Wall Street Journal, saying he was starting a proxy fight. He wants to add 3 directors to Illumina's board, basically all, people within the Icahn universe, really not like people from the science world. And his issue specifically is what Illumina has done around the cancer testing company Grail. Of course, Grail is a company that actually was founded as part of Illumina, and then Illumina spun it out in 2016. It raised $2 billion privately and continued developing this blood test for multiple cancers in the pre-symptomatic phase. People call it liquid biopsy. I think other people use the term like multi-cancer detection or something like that. And, there's a lot of promise there. And over, the years when it was independent, it, did these massive studies and then came out with some data, and Illumina decided that it needed to basically reacquire it and spent $8 billion to do so. But then, as we've covered on the show before, there were a lot of regulatory and antitrust issues around that. The US challenged it and Europe challenged it. And as of this point, Europe is actually the major problem for them. They are sort of waiting a decision to see if they have to divest Grail. In the meantime, they've had to write down, significant amount of money around the deal. They've had to keep it operating separately. They haven't integrated it. And the stock price has fallen pretty precipitously. A market value, that's declined maybe by $40 billion over the last couple of years. And so Icahn argues they just need to get out of Grail and move on. They used colorful language in their letter, which they often do, taking issue with the way management has handled it. I think that, Matt Herper wrote a great story about this for Stat, that Illumina has argued that this is a massive opportunity and it needs to be in it. But the way you saw the stock react when the news of the Icahn proxy battle came out, it went up about 14%. Carl Icahn then came on CNBC earlier this week with Scott Wapner and said that created something like $7 billion in market value. So they're going to proceed, I guess, with this proxy fight. It does sound like the two sides are talking, although Icahn said on CNBC that they've agreed not to disclose the nature of the conversations. So we'll see what ends up happening. It does seem like investors, at least from the stock reaction, support the idea of exiting Grail. And reading the analyst notes and talking with people in the space, they feel like it's been a distraction, it's been dilutive, and they kind of just want the company to keep focusing on what it's doing. It sort of feels to me like this moment where if Grail is really this powerful technology that really can detect cancer at this early stage, it could be this moment where it doesn't make a lot of money right now, but in the future, it could be really massive. And if they don't invest in this space, are they missing out on this huge opportunity, even though right now it doesn't look good to Wall Street? What do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, that has been the investment thesis for Grail and other companies in that space for going on like a decade now, which predates Grail's existence. But this technology has been gradually in development for quite a long time. And part of that graduality, may or may not be a word, is just the sheer amount of data one would need to establish that these screenings should be widespread. The potential that you're describing is that these would be like omnipresent tools in medicine to rule out or diagnose cancer at its earliest stages. But that's been theoretical for so long that you can see, and I remember how they phrased it, Illumina's point that we need to be in this space, not necessarily for next quarter or next year, but for the future of this business. And that's fair enough. But Carl Icahn's bullet points with respect to even just the numbers involved, it has plainly been a disastrous, and quixotic is a word you see thrown around on this, journey to reacquire this company. It's possible, though, 10 years from now, Illumina will have been forced to divest Grail or whatever happened, that they're no longer in this market. And in fact, liquid biopsy becomes a cornerstone of medicine. And there's a Harvard Business School case study about how if only Illumina had stayed the course, etc. But I mean, that's a really hard case to make when, as you mentioned, they're running the company at arm's length. So they're kind of just setting money on fire by virtue of just like not getting any synergies, as the jargon goes, from this acquisition that they've made and are wedded to. Furthermore, their base business, being the world's largest supplier of genome sequencing machines, has been eroding. If you're a shareholder, you're looking at this management team went on this lark, bought this thing that they used to own for more money than they spun it out for, are burning cash left and right. And meanwhile, the store that they're meant to be minding, the genome sequencing business, is not going as well as it used to. So, I mean, it's like a powder keg for an activist. And then they, of course, attracted Carl Icahn, who is sort of the like Webster's dictionary image next to the phrase activism. So I'm sympathetic, and it's possible that Illumina will be vindicated in the long run. But based on the facts right now, it's hard to see them winning this.
I have no deep thoughts about this except to say that Carl Icahn is money.
Speaking of money, Pfizer spent $43 billion this week on Seagen. Adam.
Yes, the Pfizer, the Pfizer Seagen deal, $43 billion, was announced on Monday. Obviously, there had been some rumors of these talks that were reported by the Wall Street Journal earlier, but, it was kind of a nice Monday. I think people sort of were rolling into Monday with a lot of fear about the whole Silicon Valley Bank thing and what that impact was going to be like in the biotech markets. And then, Pfizer helps everybody's mood by announcing a $43 billion deal for Seagen. Obviously, this is a deal that is focused on cancer drugs. Seagen is one of the developers, and you're really kind of one of the pioneers of a class of cancer drugs called antibody-drug conjugates. These are antibodies that direct cancer-killing chemotherapy directly to tumors. Pfizer wants to be in that ADC, so-called ADC world, and so is spending this large amount of money to acquire Seagen. For Pfizer, this is a deal that, is probably sort of fits into what they've talked about strategically. We all know that they have, revenue is falling because of slowing sales of their COVID vaccine and COVID treatments. And they were looking to very, very vocally, very publicly saying that we are going to go out and buy revenue in the near term. I think they had sort of a 2030 target to acquire $30 billion in new revenue. And so this deal helps them do that. I think Pfizer estimates that Seagen, they're about a $2 billion revenue company today that can grow to about $10 billion. That is very attractive to Pfizer. And from Seagen's point of view, I think it was, as we know, we've talked about on this podcast, it's been a bit of an up and down, tumultuous time for the company, for all their success developing drugs. And there were some signals there that they were going to go independent and try to stay independent. But obviously, it's hard to turn down $43 billion.
Now, we're going to hit a few more important biotech topics in rapid fire because we want to get to our really great interview with Bob Herman. So, Damien, first rapid fire topic. Pew, pew. I don't know why this is rapid fire. Damien, let's start with news on Medicare and the Inflation Reduction Act and how it's paying for drugs. Tell us what happened.
Yeah, no, it's my great honor to try to rapidly convey Medicare policy changes. But
welcome to my life as a TV reporter.
Yeah. What we learned this week is, in keeping with some of the sweeping changes to drug pricing policy that will be instituted or were instituted by the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act last year. The first thing we got to learn is a relatively convoluted thing involving certain Medicare paid for drugs that are administered in the hospital. There's a policy by which companies that have raised the prices beyond the rate of inflation will be back charged the difference. I don't know how much of a difference this is going to make in terms of actual pharmaceutical profits, but we got a list of 27 drugs that fit that criteria, which is say the manufacturers raise the price faster than inflation. Some of them are relatively obscure in our terms because they're hospital administered drugs. I think one of the big through lines was that Pfizer is the manufacturer of 5 of them, which is, it has the most drugs on the list. And speaking of the $43 billion in spending, that number will turn over to 6 once it closes the acquisition of Seagen, because Seagen's PacDev, a cancer treatment, is also on that list. Again, it remains to be seen whether this is really going to make a difference. The much bigger thing that everybody frets about and is upset about is the notion of Medicare negotiating drug prices for an escalating number of drugs starting in a few years. And what we also got this week was a 91-page, quote unquote, detailed explanation of how Medicare is going to approach that. The lessons of that are way beyond, I think, what we can say rapidly, but basically they give us a few clues as we await Medicare actually naming the first 10 medicines that it will negotiate on, and then that number will increase over time. So meanwhile, this is all continuing to play out on the, I was going to say angst, of the pharmaceutical industry, which may or may not mount a legal challenge to all of this. So it's very much just kind of a wait and see situation.
Pew pew. Next topic, Meg. There was an interesting decision by the Veterans Administration regarding an Alzheimer's treatment. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So usually when you see a treatment coverage decision for this new class of Alzheimer's drugs, it's that they're not going to cover the drugs. But in a twist, the Veterans Health Administration came out and said they actually will cover Leqembi, the drug that has been approved through the accelerated approval pathway from Eisai and Biogen. And Adam, tell us why this is notable.
Yeah, Meg, it's notable because when Aduhelm was approved, the Veterans Health Administration denied reimbursement. They said they weren't going to cover it. So, the fact that they're covering the Leqembi, let's say they decided that they will cover it. There's certain restrictions to that coverage, but they will cover it. Where they said they would not cover Aduhelm is noteworthy. I think that's probably the best takeaway.
Finally, the notes here that we used to plan this podcast read simply Aaron Rodgers. Adam, why are we talking about Aaron Rodgers?
Aaron Rodgers, the former Green Bay Packers quarterback who's now going to the Jets. We've wanted to bring sports into this podcast forever, and here's our opportunity.
That was a very generous we. I had no interest in doing so.
Maybe I do. Aaron Rodgers while he's known for being a quarterback, he's also known more recently as being somewhat of a big pharma conspiracy theorist. He blamed Moderna, Pfizer, and Johnson & Johnson specifically for bad media coverage of him when he said that he had gotten COVID vaccinated, but then actually didn't and lied about it. But he blamed Big Pharma for that. It's now interesting that he's going to the Jets. The Jets are owned by Woody Johnson, heir to the Johnson & Johnson fortune. So I guess Aaron will be cashing paychecks from a Big Pharma heir, and that's fun, and we can talk about that on this podcast.
And now we've done so.
Pew, pew.
Pew, pew.
We've heard a lot in recent years about the promise and the peril of artificial intelligence. ChatGPT is such a powerful tool, for example, that the journal Nature recently issued guidelines stating that it and other so-called large language models can't be credited as authors on research papers.
It shocked me that was even happening. But AI's use by health insurers can be particularly problematic, as stat reporters Casey Ross and Bob Herman discovered in an investigation published this week. Bob joins us now. Welcome back to the Read Out Loud.
Hello, esteemed podcasters. Thanks for having me.
So, Bob, your investigation focused specifically on Medicare Advantage. Let's start with what that is, how it's different from traditional Medicare, and why it appeals to patients.
Sure. So anyone over the age of 65 or someone who has disabilities is eligible for Medicare. And there are two options you can take. The traditional Medicare program, which almost every doctor participates. It's just a very broad blanket insurance coverage. And then Medicare Advantage is this growing alternative. It's basically, think of it like a commercial insurance plan. You have networks of doctors, you have, different out-of-pocket payments. And so people gravitate toward Medicare Advantage, though, because oftentimes it is cheaper. And it includes extra benefits like dental and vision insurance, which aren't included in traditional Medicare. So it's a very popular program. It includes lots of bells and whistles that the standard program does not have.
So to the focus of your story, you discovered that Medicare Advantage is using algorithms generated by AI to inform or even dictate coverage decisions for patients. So tell us about Frances Walter, who opens your story.
Yeah, it's Frances was an 85-year-old in Wisconsin. She had shattered her left shoulder. She was in a lot of pain, and so she had to go to a nursing home for her care per her doctor's orders. She was on a Medicare Advantage plan, and that plan said it worked with a contractor, and this contractor was called NaviHealth, and it basically spit out this algorithm that said patients like Frances Walter would probably only need 16.6 days in a nursing home. So the Medicare Advantage plan saw this, it stuck to it, and on the 17th day, it cut off payment. So that meant Frances was kind of left out on the cold. She didn't know what she would owe. And from there, it just turned into a long appeals process. If this happens to patients, they can appeal it. And this is a very long and labyrinthian process. So just a very hard and fast kind of cold reading without taking any consideration of Frances's pain, the condition she was in. She was still in very rough shape at that point, too. So it was just a very stark contrast to see an algorithm based on where the patient was.
So essentially, she wasn't good to go on day 17, and yet that was the end of paying for her care. And your investigation found that her experience isn't unique, right? That these AI algorithms have led to more and more denials of medical claims in Medicare Advantage?
That's right. And if you think about it, like health insurance companies deny medical claims all the time. This is a story as old as time. But what's different with this is they are using these algorithms to almost justify these denials of payment. If it's evidence-based, if it's scientific, the thinking is, okay, we're trying to make sense of this, usually cold process. But every Medicare Advantage insurer is now using some type of care company that uses these algorithms, and it's widespread. So if you're a patient in need of post-acute care after a long hospital stay, if you're sick and injured, it's very likely your care is getting dictated by an algorithm. It's trying to, and the whole point of this was to say, hey, let's not have someone stay in a nursing home for 60 days when they don't need to be. But the pendulum has just swung so far in the other direction to where it's cutting people off of care that they still actually need. And it's not really asking the doctor, asking the patient whether there should be some kind of exception.
Bob, how do these algorithms work?
Great question. My colleague Casey Ross would probably be better versed, but the short of it from both of us would be we don't really know. When providers get these denials of care, they ask and say, hey, what went into the algorithm? The insurance company almost always says, no, we can't tell you. It's proprietary. So we really have no idea what goes into them. I know some data scientists would like to know that answer as well and have tried to figure it out. But the short of it is we have no idea what goes into them. It's based off of medical claims, but in terms of how it's structured and how it reaches these certain conclusions, we don't know.
Well, and as your story points out, there are other AI models used in medicine, specifically those used by physicians to detect cancer or suggest the best treatment for a disease, and these are evaluated by the FDA, at least typically. How are these tools used by insurers regulated?
They're not. There is kind of the short answer to that too. So they use these algorithms through all their different products use these algorithms. But there's no requirement to, for example, run it through a peer review or run it by, a regulatory agency to say, hey, is this okay? Now, CMS, the agency that runs Medicare, is looking into this a little bit. There is a pending rule that kind of tries to get at this idea of regulating insurers using these algorithms to make these proprietary coverage decisions. So that is at least promising, but we don't fully know which direction it's going to go in. The rules due sometime this spring. And there's still concern it could be quite limited because, for example, the insurance company or the algorithm maker would have to post some of the stuff publicly, but they could still move forward with the criteria, even if it does still seem unfair. It's hard to say what will happen, but for right now, there's no regulation over these.
I have to apologize if you can hear the lawn tools outside my window. It is somehow not spring, and yet they are in full force here in the suburbs. So you note in the story that these predictive tools are being acquired by insurers. For instance, the one you mentioned, NavaHealth, which made the AI algorithm that ended the payments for Frances Walter, it's owned by United Health, right?
Exactly. That is kind of the big business turn in all this is these companies are increasingly being scooped up by health insurers. And the thinking is if you're a health insurer, why not just own as much of this as you can? these decisions or these algorithms and AI inform your decision making. So why not have it in-house? And you're right. United Health bought this a few years ago for not a small sum of money. It was valued around over $2 billion. So these are very valuable tools. And United is not the only one. That United owns NaviHealth, but you think of Anthem or Elevance, Cigna, CVS, Aetna, all the Blues, they all use or own pieces of these different tools.
And what do the makers of these AI predictive tools, and their corporate owners, these big insurance companies, what do they say about the increased use in Medicare Advantage plans? Like what to them is the benefit of these tools?
For what it's worth, we reached out to them for this story, and they said that, and again, this goes to the whole issue of we don't want wasteful care. We don't want someone in a nursing home or an inpatient rehab facility just to sit there and rack up dollars for the facility. We want to make sure that the person's getting the right care. But obviously, this is going the other way where we're just kind of kicking people out of facilities and sending them home potentially unsafely. And so they still say like, oh, if we don't, these aren't hard and fast rules. These are guidelines, which if you ask anyone, they say, no, people use these algorithms as guidelines. They kick them out whenever they can. And then, the insurers and these algorithm companies also say, we offer peer-to-peer reviews, which is when doctors on their side get together with doctors in the facilities and they try to hash things out. But oftentimes those same things those peer-to-peers result in the same thing. It's just, we're sticking to the algorithm. So they say that it's not a hard and fast rule, but if you ask anyone else, it sure feels like it.
So Bob, this kind of freaks me out as a patient, you run into these situations where you get these letters from your insurer about what they're going to cover, what they're not going to cover, and you just can feel really helpless. And this almost feels like it's taking it to another level of sort of helplessness. And I guess, are there any takeaways for, the patients in this situation about either choosing plans or how to kind of navigate through this? What sort of new world is this opening up that people should be aware of as they're thinking about picking their insurance?
It's a good question, Meg. And that's something else that Casey and I found is, ultimately the patients and their caregivers, their families, who are helping to take care of them, they have no idea these algorithms exist. None. They just see a care denial. And why would you know, right? You're just picking the insurance plan and you assume that your care is covered to some degree. So the fact that patients just have, and their families have no idea that this is going on it's obviously troublesome. But a takeaway from this is, obviously think hard about, when you're eligible for Medicare, what plan you choose, or if you want to stay in traditional Medicare. There are clear trade-offs, in choosing a Medicare Advantage plan. And if you do pick a Medicare Advantage plan, know that you still have rights in terms of being able to appeal these things. You can appeal coverage denials. It's a long, winding, pretty grueling process with a lot of bureaucracy, but you can get through it. There are legal aid groups that can help you. So that's another takeaway is if this does happen to you, it could be a long road, but there are potentially ways to fight to get your care covered.
Bob, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Hello and welcome to the premiere episode of the Read Out Loud, a weekly biotech podcast from Stat. I'm Damian Garde.
I'm Adam Feuerstein.
And I'm Rebecca Robbins.
We are coming to you from Stat's global headquarters here in Boston. It is Thursday, March 8th, and here's what we're going to talk about this week.
Martin Shkreli will find out how long he'll spend behind bars.
Private biotech companies can pick and choose what they tell the public, and sometimes that's bad.
Everyone talks about the benefits of the biotech boom, but what if it goes bust?
And finally, Rebecca will tell us what it was like to go to a society gala in West Palm Beach, Florida to learn about young blood transfusions.
But first, a word from our sponsor.
Wow, Damien, I have never heard you that happy in my entire life.
He was punchy, yes.
Yeah, that's take number 25 after being told more energy, more energy, more energy. And also I pronounced premier like the British way. I don't know if that was the result of
if everyone is confused,
psychological strain.
If everyone's confused, this is our 250th episode of the Read Out Loud. So we thought, wow, it would be really fun to listen to episode number 1, which you just heard. I think I still, you guys reacted to my little take there on Martin Shkreli. I can never pronounce his last name. Was that why?
How far we've come in 250 episodes.
I know. I still can't do it.
I think now he's out of prison, so
Yeah.
we come full circle.
That's true, yeah.
Happy 250 episodes.
Boy.
Thank you, listeners, for sticking with us this long.
And that does it for another episode, the 250th episode of the Read Out Loud.
Thank you to Teresa Gaffney for producing this week's episode.
Our senior producers are Hyacinth Empanato and Alyssa Ambrose. Our executive producer is Rick Burke, and our theme music is by Brian Joel.
We'd love to hear from you. Tell us what you like about this week's episode, what you didn't, and whether we have another 250 episodes in us. You can do all that by sending us an email at readoutloud@statnews.com.
And if you like what we do, leave a review or a rating on Apple Podcasts or whichever platform you use to get your podcasts.
See you next week.